I know your children probably have a wide range of disabilities, and some of them will be cognitive in nature. And so the challenges are a little bit different than, for example, if you have a math disability. What I want to start by talking to you about is a math disability, because for the parents in the room, supporting your children is often getting past the fact that you probably could do very, very well at math. I'm an example of that. In fact, what we have is, if you've heard of dyslexia, what we have is this sort of, I wouldn't call it a sister diagnosis, it's called dyscalculia. And it's where you have this difficulty recognizing numbers, processing numbers. And with dyslexia, the interesting thing about it, which really talks to the parents in terms of how you can support it, if you can support your child, there's only 3 to 6% of the population that even have it. So usually when I ask a room, how many of you think you had some kind of math disability when you were growing up? I would have been one of those people to put my hand up, but I didn't. It's such a small percentage that this is the diagnosis. 3 to 6%, which means everybody else, provided that there isn't that cognitive piece that we're dealing with, or there's a couple of other types of sort of disorders that affect number processing. That means that we all have the potential to do exactly what I did. Exactly what I did. And what we often see if you have a true diagnosis of dyscalculia, it's typically there aren't any other delays in other academic areas. That's a sort of characteristic of dyslexia. Pretty good everything else, but has a real problem with numbers. And so when you're looking at dyscalculia, the kind of telltale signs are that children have even difficulty recognizing their own fingers. So if you put fingers up and say how many, they can't show you 2, they can't count 2, they can't show you 3. And this is definitely a disorder that is recognized, and it's one that is understood to have an actual neurological basis to it. So again, it's only a very small percentage of the population. So if you're one of these parents who are actually in the room thinking that I can't support my child, the reality is you probably can. What we know about teaching in mathematics, and I'm a clear example of it, is that our experiences are often highly, highly related to the quality of the teaching. And so the better opportunities you have to learn, the more likely you're going to learn. But if they did have dyscalculia, what are the sort of things you might see? It's also got huge sort of spatial factors that you notice. They have trouble with directions, left, right, north, south. These children have trouble with physical coordination, a lot of trouble with money, making change, knowing how to give change, knowing what an appropriate amount of change is, having judgments with change. I point these 3 out because when you have a child that has learning disabilities, and depending on the severity of it, these 3 are pretty important basic life skills. These are pretty important basic life skills that we want to focus children on. So while it's part of the disability, it's still probably 3 of the most important things we want to be able to support our children to do. So there's this interesting relationship between dyscalculia and dyslexia. More typically, we test for dyslexia rather than dyscalculia. But what we know is that there is approximately a 40 to 65% chance that if your child has been diagnosed with dyslexia, that there's a 40 to 60% chance they're going to have dyscalculia too. And it's often missed. It's often missed because we don't tend to test for it. We notice the reading before we notice the math. We notice the writing before we notice the math. And this is a very interesting fact too, because they say that the reason that the factors of dyslexia and the factors that influence dyscalculia are different. They have different cognitive profiles, and yet we see this comorbidity of the two, a high incidence of the two if you've got dyslexia. And so just quickly, when you look at dyslexia, it's a pattern of learning difficulties with word or reading recognition. That's a little bit more common. 4 to 10% of the population, and then of that 4 to 10%, you've got that approximately 40% that will struggle with numbers too. And dyslexia, which I think is where the translation is, there's some research that I've been working on, has an impairment of, general impairment of spatial perception. It's a crowding effect that happens sometimes, that they're proposing happens, which has a mathematical basis too. So dyscalculia is sort of the actual math disability, but again, very small percentage. What most of us have is this. Now, how many would say that in their lifetime they've experienced math anxiety? That's pretty low. Usually there's been sheer panic when you have a math exam or a math test, or someone puts you on the spot, for example, if I was to do a math problem with you. I was looking at the numbers of what percentage of the population have reported actually suffering from math anxiety, and the numbers were astronomically high. The issue here is that you've been exposed with the underlying reason for this math anxiety is instances where you've not had good success, and it creates these sort of negative feelings, and also being exposed to negative attitudes. This is one of those instances where I say that your negative experiences of mathematics have a big influence on your children. And it's also one of the things that I say is we should lie about. If our children ever ask us, how did you feel about math, or how were you at math, this is where you have to tell them a different story. It's really important, particularly for young girls, that they hear that you really enjoyed it, you loved it. I know this is terrible to say, but it was something that you were really interested in, because they're picking up the negative attitudes, and that's resulting in that sort of math anxiety, and it impacts their performance and ability to do the mathematics. They pick it up from two sources. Legitimately, it's picked up from parents, but the other place that it's picked up from, unfortunately, is teachers. Teachers are also very anxious about mathematics, just like the general population. We have remarkably very little training in mathematics, and so if you're a person like me who came with a bad history of mathematics, and now I'm supporting your child, and it's the last thing that I want to teach every day, anything but the math, it comes across to the children. And so my work has also primarily involved working with teachers to get them past this feeling that they can't do the math, or they struggled with the math, or they had a bad history with the math. This probably will impact your child more than the first slide I showed you, the math anxiety. And if your child has anything like obsessive disorders or any anxiety disorders, this will just be amplified, especially if they're not interested in doing the mathematics. So this creates a number of challenges, both from the parent side and both from the teacher side, and it sort of manifests itself in the child. It is something we've been working on pretty extensively with teachers, but it's also really important to get the message out to parents that any negative talk, any sort of bad feelings you have, we know the research tells us it sort of gets translated to your child. And so that leads to the next point. No bad math talk, no trashing math. You probably don't. You're working with your child who's got special needs, and you're probably not doing this. However, what we do see is that it's easy to say things like, I wasn't good at math, or I didn't like it either, or we should be focusing on something else. And so the very first suggestion that I'm going to make to you as parents is that this actually has to be eliminated if you have any of that happening, even with older children in the home. It has a significant impact in terms of the child's perception. So some of the strategies, for some of your children, I will say that as parents, I would encourage you to think about the challenges that your children face in this room will vary. And you are the best assessor of what is the functional level of mathematics that you think that they can do, will do, should do. What kind of mathematics do they need to function in their everyday lives? For some children, those are the questions we have to ask. And for some children with special needs, the the greatest accomplishment is learning how to give change. And so one of the things that we encourage with families is find the mathematics in everyday things. Put the math into things. For example, when you're asking the child to pick something up, it's can you pick up 2? Can you pick up 3? What we know is showing them the representations with their fingers and the words actually has an impact on their uptake of the knowledge. Counting, measuring, pattern recognition. Let's look at the flower, look at your train. Some of your children may be obsessive about patterns already, but when you start talking about the patterns and highlighting it, it starts to sort of integrate that mathematical content into what they're doing every day. The biggest thing that you could do for your child is to find that sort of math in everything that they're doing. And it's really interesting because we say that by the time a child goes to school, they have about 1,000 hours of reading. And the estimates are very poor on math. By the time they get to school, what we see is that they've had like 40 hours. So we do a lot to try to get children to read, but we don't do a whole lot to try to get them to count. And I mentioned to you, focus on the need to know mathematics. What I've seen often in cases, at least as I worked as a math teacher, there wasn't a great there were instances where I didn't have a good partnership with the parent. And you really need a good partnership with the parent to understand where is the skill level, what is the goal that we're trying to get them to. Do we have a knowledge of up to the number 10? Are we working on 2-digit, on 3-digit? Are we ready to do more complex patterns? What you are seeing in the home may be very different than what the teacher's seeing. And so the partnership there is really important. And sometimes these basic skills, even though the class may be going on to more significant things, these basic skills are life skills. And so that's an important focus that may or may not be in the curriculum year that your child's working on. But this requires that you really have a good partnership with your the child's teacher and the learning support teacher. DJ was here, or DJ was speaking about the technology that he uses. There's a lot of good research that says, I know some children really perseverate on digital games. There's a lot of good research that shows that there's some impact on these digital tools on learning basic facts, game-based programs that actually help children learn. This is one area that we're really supportive of using technology to help your child learn mathematics. This is a program that I really like. It's free. It's through TV Ontario. It's called mPower, tested across Ontario, and it is really actually quite excellent. But there are a lot of them. If you're speaking to your learning resource teacher, the teacher that's supporting your child, ask them what's available, ask what you can be using, ask what they're using in class in terms of the math software. There's so many. I like this one because it's been developed by teachers, developed in Ontario, available free to all families. So the free is a really good thing, and also the fact that it has been tested by teachers, it has been tested in schools, and it goes up according to grades. So, and there's parts of it that don't require a lot of language-intensive material, like language-intensive skills. There is so much research on the value of games. And there's some games in particular that are really useful. Snakes and ladders, incredibly useful for developing number skills. It's in fact my go-to tool. Snakes and ladders, depending on your child's ability, it's not in the rolling of the dice and playing the first game. It's in the rolling of the dice and winning the first game and being able to define the rule for the second game. So the first game may be rolling the dice and moving forward, but the second game, if you win, you get to add 1, or you get to say subtract 1, or you could add a pattern rule, or you can create cards that will allow you to add a pattern rule, or it could be an add 10, or an add 5, or you can get special dice that will only roll 5 to get children to start learning those numbers. Snakes and ladders is an incredibly useful tool. There is the other kind of toy that has a lot of research is blocks. Blocks have incredible research in terms of helping children develop their spatial skills in particular, which shows that those spatial skills then help the number skills. The key with the blocks is the parent again. And it's not in necessarily you sitting, like I hated blocks. I had 2 sons, I hated blocks. I actually didn't like toys, which is why I had the desk beside the photocopier. I wasn't a play kind of kid. But blocks are really interesting because for parents, what's really impactful is not so much you sitting on the floor and building with them. It's you walking by and noticing and saying, do you think you could put 3 more on? Or could you make a bridge? Or can you join these 2? It's you actually asking a question or encouraging them to make it more complex. That's where the value of the parent is there. It's the pushing of the complex structure rather than, not that the research is also quite clear that if you sit down and play with your child building blocks, it's also more helpful, but it's in asking these questions. So puzzles, card games, any of these sort of things that have a numerical basis are really helpful. I mentioned this earlier about partnering with your child's teacher and teachers partner with the parents. I was a little bit, I mean, we listened to the talk this earlier from DJ about his experiences. That has not been the case in education for, we've come such a long way. We have come such a long way in terms of advocating for children and the dignity of the child. I'm not suggesting you don't experience it anymore, but it's no longer acceptable to have those kinds of experiences. But it has to be a true partnership. The teacher is not likely going to see the kind of number things that you're doing in your home with your child unless you make it explicit. The teacher is not likely going to, may not even see that he's doing or she's doing really important patterning. And by working together, you can actually figure out a way to actually extend it a little bit more beyond the context of the classroom. So this partnership is key, but I know that you already all know that.
That's the one thing, though, is that you don't get enough interaction with your teachers. You get one 15-minute, parent-teacher interview, and basically that's all the kind of interaction you get for the whole year.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
Oh, well, unless you're doing your writing back and forth and
Writing,
stuff like
yeah.
that. But it'd be nice to go in and actually observe your kid while they're in class or something like that. You know what I mean? But they don't have that opportunities.
Right. I will say that Government of Ontario, Ministry of Education is really, I mean, there's been some legislative changes that are, as you know, especially with children with special needs, about the role of the parent. The ministry has an entire branch on parent engagement because the ministry recognizes that we share custody. Technically, we share custody of these children, the teacher and the parent. And so there is a real move in the system to say we need you in the classroom, we need to be communicating with you, we need to be partnering with you, more than I would actually say that I've seen in the last 10 years. So much so that you're seeing, as I said, this parent engagement branch of the Ministry of Education. So I would encourage you to think about ways to reaching out and trying to get better access, but it is a culture that's moving towards really insisting that it's there.
So Donna, 1 minute?
Okay. Learn where to look for help. There's some great blogs. For example, there's a dyscalculablog.com. There is a wonderful math help for grade 7 and 8 students, completely free through TVO, that you could log in and ask a question. There's all sorts of things online. TVO, Teach Ontario, has incredible resources that can actually direct you. But some of these organizations that actually, even if your child isn't formally identified with dyscalculia, this is a great resource for things that you could be doing at home. Homework involvement. It's not necessarily you sitting and doing the homework with the child. That's not what it looks like, kind of like block play. When we talk about homework involvement, it's sort of being present, saying, how's it going? What are you doing? What's interesting? Can you show me what you're doing, or teach me what you're doing? Or I did it a little bit different. Can you show me how you're doing it? And again, back to the first point, we really have to avoid sort of, this is how I did it. Just do it this way. Because what we know, especially in today's approaches, that we see a lot of varied ways of doing things. So teaching strategies, for those of you, we teach in chunks. Little chunks that we know that we master. We build on prior knowledge. If your child's having trouble with writing and organizing, graph paper is incredible for printing, even for writing, because it's one box, one letter. Graph paper is a really great software. You know that you're probably getting extra time. We want to reduce the pressure, particularly on the anxiety. I mentioned earlier multimodal, not only with your mouth, but with your hands, showing the numbers with your fingers and your hands. It's going to take different assessment strategies, but that's a good thing, because currently within the policies in Ontario, teachers are required to assess in 3 different ways: tell me, show me, and conversation. So encourage risk-taking. I mean, let them try different things without actually forcing them to do it one way or the other. There's no way of avoiding practice. Math is a sit-down sport, and the practice piece is hard to do. But if you build the practice in with those games that I mentioned and play and the technology, everything changes. And it's not going to be a one approach fits all. The classroom, there's some things in the classroom that you may have to teach directly, but your child may need to show it with blocks, or your child may need to show it on a computer. And look for those strategies, know where their multimodal sort of differences are in their learning styles. So the last slide is my contact if you want to contact me. Yes, there we go.